All right. Hi there, and welcome to the US Web Design System monthly call for June of 2020. My name is Dan Williams, and I'm the US Web Design System project lead. Happy early Juneteenth, and thanks for being here today. We've got a great hour planned. I think it's a great hour. Yeah, it's a great hour. We've got a great hour planned, starting with a couple notable site launches, and then a look at some of the improvements we just released in US Web Design System version 2.7.1. And then we'll review a few of the components and new work that is coming in the next few weeks. And then we'll get to the heart of today's presentation with some of my GSA colleagues from 18F who will talk about how they've used the design system, and specifically about how designers and the design system can work together. And we should have a bit of time for Q&A afterwards as well. So think of any questions as we go along, add them to the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them at the end of the hour. So, first up, new site launches. We've had a couple new nice USWDS sites launch over the last month, including, where are we? Yeah, including the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, which just launched I don't know, a couple weeks ago. And this complements the civil rights violation reporting tool that we saw last month. So it's good to see those up and working together. And also new is the US Equal Employment Opportunity Commission site. It's nice to see that up in a nice new crisp design system version. So two great new sites, really great work, and it's heartening to see this new work, so keep it up. Next up, product updates. Yesterday, we released USWDS 2.7.1, and that's the point release follow-up to the new work we introduced in 2.7.0. And this release has a number of important improvements to the design system, which I'll sort of run through a couple of them here, but you can read the whole thing in full over in the GitHub release notes that I think we'll post into the chat. So in general, we've been listening to your feedback on all the new components we've released. And over the last couple of weeks, we've made a number of improvements to the interaction and functionality of the combo box. A lot that goes into a combo box. And there are a lot of interactions, both big and small, that go into that combo box. And your feedback on the combo box has been important in helping us make that work better. And so we improved the overall interaction of the box, particularly around subsequent selection, making it easier to clear the input and navigate away from a selection in the primary input into the dropdown. And we also fixed a rotten little bug with the scroll bar, where scroll bar appeared, but it wasn't actually selectable and draggable, which I guess defeats the purpose of a scroll bar. But now the scroll bar is draggable and scrolls just the way you would expect a scroll bar to scroll. We also improved the way the component communicates the focus and selection state. There's always a little bit of ambiguity perhaps around what element is receiving focus as you're sort of moving through the elements in the combo box list. I think we're doing a much better way of communicating what has focus and what's selected in this new version of the combo box. And we also fixed a bug that prevented the disabled state of the combo box from working properly. Now it does work properly. We're also better supporting change events with selections when selections change. And we're collecting all the implementation guidance related to all of these functional improvements on the website, and sort of trying to do a better job of communicating just everything that's involved with a complex component like combo box in the documentation. So USWDS 2.7.1 also makes a number of improvements to the way the design system uses Flexbox, resulting in a more reliable Flexbox layout across browsers and operating systems. And we use Flexbox for a lot of things in the design system. So we were seeing a few quirks in the way that elements were rendering in different operating systems and across different browsers. So we were able to make some changes to some of the way we're speccing out our use of Flex, so that now pretty much everything is very reliable. What you expect to see, you do see across browsers and across OSs. And sort of speaking of which, we were also able to make a few nice improvements to our IE11 support, including fixing a couple of display bugs. One of them was something that you don't always think of when you're looking at your IE11 support, but like how well it supported the mobile navigation in IE11. People do narrow their windows, and it is important to understand that the mobile navigation, needs to work in your standard browser as well as it works on a mobile device, and now it does. So we were able to make a few nice improvements to the way some of the elements were rendering in IE11, and now we also support escape key closing for menus in IE11, which wasn't working as expected before. So IE11, getting better. We'll be perfect on IE11 by the time IE11 is fully end of life. And we also fixed a color contrast problem with the accent cool button. This led us down a couple useful paths, including working to find out just why our testing didn't catch this issue, which is still is a little bit undetermined, sort of irritatingly enough. But what it also did was really helped us build some smarter support into our code base to find and fix any potential contrast issues before they bubble up into the components. And the end result of this is that the design system will be much more reliable around using accessible text colors, regardless of the colors that relate to the colors in the background, regardless of the colors your project uses for its theme colors. We're building some tools into the code base that are able to understand the relationship between the background and the text, to use the design system magic number system to sort of calculate the contrast between those, and to make changes to the text color sort of automatically if the contrast isn't sufficient. So I think as we go further and further, I think the design system code will be better able to provide good contrast out of the box, regardless of the way you set up your settings. And this is starting with buttons, but this sort of functionality will be moving into more and more of our components as we move down the road. And there's a lot more to come over the next few months. You'll see as we move forward that we're working to release promptly and improve quickly. We want to work to get new components, guidance, and functionality out in front of you, and then to start improving on those things as quickly as we can. So thank you for all your feedback and testing and contribution in the public Slack and in GitHub. Constructive feedback makes us better. Signing up for and participating in some of our lightweight usability testing makes us better. Your discussions in the Slack and in GitHub make us better, so keep it up. Thank you. And we'll do our part to keep up the new work. Coming soon over the next few weeks, certainly by the next time we have a monthly call, we'll see some more component releases. New components like breadcrumb, like a date picker, finally getting to the date picker, and date range picker. Also file input, like a file uploader, and a tooltip. as well as a few updates and improvements to the Gov banner as well. So stay tuned and follow along with our work on our product roadmap board at this cool URL, github.com/org/USWDS/project/4. And also on our project sprint board. I won't read out that URL. And also on the advanced forms project board, which contains the progress on the work in a lot of the forms and pickers that we're working on. So now I'd like to get to the main event of today's call, a discussion on the role of designers on design system projects. The design system can be a powerful tool to help teams build websites better and faster, but a design system is still a tool, just a tool. I don't know if it's just, it's still a tool. It's not a replacement for a designer or a developer. Just as like a voice and tone style guide isn't a replacement for a writer. How can designers work with the design system to make it an effective tool in their workflow? Are designers and a design system at odds? What does it mean what does it mean to do design work in the context of a design system? How can they complement and strengthen each other, designers and the design system? What does a designer bring to a design system project? To explore those ideas, I'd like to introduce three colleagues from 18F responsible for a couple useful and thought-provoking blog posts on the 18F blog. Those two posts were "Even with a Design System, You Still Need a Designer," and "A Token of Our Affection, A Field Guide to USWDS 2. So it's my pleasure to welcome Christine Bath and Austin Hernandez from 18F Product Design and Laura Gerhardt from 18F Engineering. So hi there, Christine and Austin and Laura when she gets here. Welcome, and I will stop my sharing.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having us here to chat with you all today and talk a little bit more about how we use the design system at 18F. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, is everyone able to see that? Great. Well, again, my name is Christine Bath. I'm a product designer with 18F. I use she, her pronouns. And today we're going to talk a little bit about how we use design systems at 18F. So before we get into that, as Dan mentioned, I'm accompanied by a few of my colleagues, Austin, who's a product designer here at 18F, and also Laura, who's an engineer. And a little bit about us. So we work at 18F, which is a civic consultancy for the US government inside the US government. So we're a part of GSA. And we work primarily with federal agencies and also a few state and local partners to help improve experiences with and within government. And we're government employees ourselves, so we spend a lot of time with government systems and observing government systems and designing for government systems. And we love the US Web Design System. It's a tool that we use all the time. It's a big part of all of our processes within 18F. As a designer, it's something that I use pretty much every day. And we use it so much that we actually wrote a little bit about our experiences using the web design system and how it plays into our design process. So as Dan mentioned, we recently published 2 blog posts on the 18F blog about this. One focusing on, as a designer, like what are the ways that we use the design system and where are some of the places the design system helps us and what are some of the other activities that we use to accomplish good design. And then we also wrote A Token to Our Affection, a field guide to the USWDS 2, which talks a little bit more about what that designer-developer communication looks like in the context of the design system. And the US Web Design System is a big part of how we work. but using a design system does not guarantee a successful design or user experience. But as Dan mentioned, like, it is a very helpful tool for solving a design problem. So today we want to talk to you about how we use the web design system alongside other tools and methods to solve design problems within some of the projects we've worked on. So some of the specific things we'll talk a little bit about are why design systems don't replace designers, how design systems help solve some problems but not every problem, and how we use design systems to work better together. So to get started, I'm going to pass it over to Austin to talk through a little bit about how some of his work and how he used the design system in that work.
Thanks, Christine. Yep. Hey, I'm Austin Hernandez. I use he, him pronouns, and I am based out of Brooklyn, New York. Christine, if you could go to the next slide. This is a tale about how I designed findtreatment.gov using the US Web Design System. And findtreatment.gov is a website that helps people find state licensed treatment facilities for people dealing with substance abuse and mental health disorders and addiction and things of that nature. So next slide, Christine. Okay. And as you can imagine, it's a pretty heavy subject. And the first place that we always start with any project is through research. And as we wrote about in the blog, that a lot of our users could be in crisis mode. They could be in a hurry, they could be in a life-threatening situation. So it's really important that we are taking into account these wide range of emotions and circumstances that people are going through while we're designing, and make sure that we are designing an interface that meets those needs. And that's what we call inclusive design. Next slide, Christine. Thank you. So the US Web Design System has accessibility components right out of the box. So things like better code to make it easier to work with a screen reader. But technology is not a replacement, as Dan said earlier, for people and understanding pain point. So we do a lot of research into this, and with an inclusive design framework, so talking to a lot of people who this website would hopefully be a solution for them. We were able to find trends in our data from user interviews and usability testing, and that helped us develop some principles and behavioral archetypes. Sometimes they're called personas, but we use archetypes in this project based on our findings through research, which in the long run helps us build more efficiently and accurately when we're working with the web design system to build a website. So next slide, if you could. This is another part that we brought up in the blog post, which is really important to visual design specifically, that users rely on visual cues to understand a site's broader context. If a website doesn't look quote unquote trustworthy, users will proceed with caution. And that obviously is a pretty relative term, I guess. And that is why it's really important for us to make sure that not all government sites look exactly the same, because trust and recognition are not universal. So we have to make sure that the design that we are creating matches the tone and the subject for each of the agency's unique mission. If you could go to the next slide. So to accomplish that, to kind of answer that question, I made this messy thing that you see before you. It's just to give you an idea about something that we do in the practice. What this is a design audit. It's looking at a whole bunch of different sites who are in the general stratosphere of substance abuse or mental health or primary health care. It's a whole bunch of sites that I looked at and tried to understand, I guess, and dissect. So they're nonprofits, they're for-profits, they're city or state provided resources for people battling with substance abuse. And we were able to see patterns emerge from putting all of these sites together. And what I did was put these in a spectrum of a very like clinical design that's very straightforward of like, you have a problem, let us fix it, to a very kind of we were saying that it felt more feel good, where it was maybe a for-profit company that was like, if you just come to our website or our facility, we can fix you and make you better. And we wanted to achieve a tone that was in the middle of both of those things. As a government provided resource, we didn't want to make any false claims, but we do want to give the people who were accessing this website hope that they were on the right track. So using this visual design audit, we could see where we wanted to be kind of in the middle. And that included websites that, you know, didn't use too much imagery, but found that imagery was very important for people to connect with the content on the website, and didn't make too many false promises, but let people know that they were in the right area. So if you could go to the next slide. From these audits, I was building mock-ups on kind of the where we wanted to be tone. And these were the three different directions. One was, you know, using like landscapes or different ways to symbolize that this is a part of our culture in the United States. Something was a person who you might, quote, not expect to have substance abuse disorder, or a wide variety of people that this may or may not impact. And if you go to the next slide. This is just a Excel spreadsheet of some of the information that we had gathered when doing research on which one of these websites kind of met that mark of the tone that we wanted to convey with findtreatment.gov. So we just asked a whole bunch of users, and you can see on the left their archetype, if they were someone who was seeking treatment, someone was helping someone find treatment, or a medical professional or counselor who was helping someone find treatment. And we just asked them one simple question, which was, which website would you most likely send to a friend or family member looking for substance use treatment? And we could see from this data that one of the mock-ups that we presented was really hitting that mark. So if you go to the next slide, Christine. Again, going back to those basic principles that we had developed early on, we made sure that it was still meeting those principles of, is it simple, is it accurate, and is it supportive? And then made sure that it worked for the archetypes that we were designing for people who were searching for treatment, and their helpers and caregivers as well. This is obviously a simplified process. The whole thing took several months, but definitely less than a year. But we were able to sharpen as we were going each iteration of research, better honing in on what we wanted to convey. And next slide. And then after that, it was super easy to use the US Web Design System sketch files and component library to build out the homepage and secondary pages. It kept things really consistent, and everything was pretty accessible out of the box. There wasn't a lot that needed to be done from a coding perspective, and a lot of the considerations were already thought out. So that made it a lot easier to design and develop, both for mobile and desktop. And next slide. So this is the final design. And this wouldn't have been possible without research and design and visual design audit and testing. Some components you can see are a little bit different from the out-of-the-box solution. But we found, that the main reason people are going to this site is to find a treatment facility near them. So it was really important to, for example, make the search location, zip code, and city and state finder large on the site. However, when we put that higher on the site, people were confused of why they wanted personal information up front. Things like, this is a government website. Am I going to get in trouble for doing illegal activity? Are people trying to find me and my information? And those were things that we did not want to convey. So stuff that might look like fluff or feel good was all purposefully designed and implemented to make people feel safe entering information that they felt could be sensitive and get them into trouble. And reassuring text, like millions of Americans are going through this same thing, helped reassure them as well, building that trust that we talked about earlier in using this website and putting trust into the results that were coming back from it. And I think that about wraps it up, and I will pass it back to Christine.
All right. Thanks, Austin. So sharing that experience of having, focusing on research, really trying to define the problem, and then working within the web design system to find that right solution and that right amount of customization. That's something that we see on a lot of projects and is a common experience that we have. So I want to talk to you about a different project and a different way that we approached it. So let's talk about the Paperwork Reduction Act. If you're not excited, I don't know. You're missing out. So the Paperwork Reduction Act is a law that governs how federal agencies collect information from the American public. It's been around since 1980, and it's something that a lot of federal workers will encounter at some point. It often affects forms and surveys, which is something that most agencies are involved with. And guidance around the PRA process comes from the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which is a part of OMB. And most of that guidance is published in PDFs that are then hosted on an OMB site. So this is the story of how we use the USWDS to help build a website about the PRA. So after decades of the PRA being in existence, there was a lot of guidance around the law, and there was also a lot of PDFs about the law. And oftentimes federal workers weren't sure how the PRA worked, what it was, and how to go through the PRA process. There was a lot of mystery around the PRA. And this uncertainty about the PRA had a cascading effect. So when federal workers wanted information from the public, like if they wanted to have a form or an online survey, there was this uncertainty around the PRA process and what that was. And sometimes that would lead to reluctance to actually modify forms because there was worry that there would be hassle and delay in going through the PRA clearance process. And it was not clear what that process actually looked like, which meant that sometimes paper forms would be copied online to avoid the PRA process entirely, which is a shame just because that's an opportunity for us to take a look at forms and see, are there ways that we can improve experiences with the public? Paper and online can be pretty different experiences. And this is important because, in government, we need good data to make good government decisions. And at the same time, gathering this data needs to be balanced against the desire to decrease burden on the public. So the PRA is important in that it helps us make sure that we're not overburdening the public, but that confusion definitely was affecting some of our data collection. So we decided to build a plain language guide to the PRA. It's hosted by our friends at Digitalgov. And before we got into building, we talked to a lot of different folks to understand what some of those common questions were about the PRA and what was confusing about it. So we talked to PRA officials who work within government agencies to understand what sort of questions they're getting from folks in their agency about the PRA. We talked to folks at OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, who are fielding questions and helping walk people through that process. And then we also talked to government employees who weren't familiar with the PRA and maybe had just kind of like heard about it in the background. And we wanted to understand what was their experience as somebody coming into this process new. And so our goal for the guide was to answer some of those most common questions about the PRA. So like, what is the PRA for? Do I need to go through a clearance process? And what does that process look like? And we used the web design system to help build the site really quickly. So after we had done some initial research, on what some of those common questions were and understanding a bit more of who was the audience for this information, we used the US web design system to start building. And it really gave us a lot out of the box. Within a couple of weeks of us starting the build process, we had a prototype up and running. So some of the things that were most helpful to us is there were templates right out of the box that worked well for rapid prototyping. So we were able to try different configurations of information, test some hypotheses. It was really easy to theme those templates so that we were able to match OMB styles and also test different visual directions. For me as a designer, like the design files had a bunch of pre-built assets and helpers right out of the box. So it reduced how much I had to create on my own, and I could kind of like skin things that were already in existence. And then as a team, me and the developer were able to kind of have a shared language from the start. So we had the same names for components, and it just made it easier for us to communicate with one another. And as always, like having a component library with that's built on best practices going in was just really helpful for me. And really, like at the end of the day, like the web design system was a very powerful tool for us because it took care of some of those easy decisions that we had to make so that we could focus on the important hard ones specific to this project. So over the course of a project, designers have to make thousands of decisions. And by having some of those tested components that had been tested based on and iterated on based on best practices, we could move quickly and more confidently than if we didn't have the design system. And it gave us, again, the opportunity to focus on some of those harder problems because really, like the hard part of this project wasn't building a website. If we were just moving existing guidance into HTML, that wasn't really going to solve our problem of helping demystify the PRA. We had to think a lot about what would actually help make this process more clear and something that would increase confidence for people. So we were very intentional about how we use patterns on the site and how it was organized. And so as we used the web design system, behind the use of each pattern, there was a lot of work to decide like why it should be there. So through our research, we answered some of the questions that we had that influenced the design of the site. So we wanted to know, what are those common PRA questions? Who asked them? We wanted to know like what guidance already existed. We didn't want to recreate things that already were useful to people. We wanted to explore how do we build trust in this information? What signals trust in legal interpretations of guidance like this? And what does an editorial process look like to get us to plain language guidance about a law that's been around for 30 years? And also, like, I think it's always important to put out, like, we were asking, like, is a website the right solution to this problem? New technology isn't always the right choice. And so we spent a lot of time considering other approaches before we decided on the plain language guide. And that's why I love this quote from Kathy Dutton. She wrote an article called "The Problem with Patterns." And I think it just really exemplifies our process. So although patterns do help teams hesitate less and build things in shorter amounts of time, it is how and why a group of patterns and components are stitched together that result in great design. Sometimes it's really tempting to jump into building if there's a bunch of beautifully and accessible and responsive patterns like right at your fingertips. But you know, deciding to build is inherently a design decision. And there's still plenty of design decisions that have to be made with those patterns. So that's why having a designer, even if you have a design system, is really important. And that's also why we love USWDS. It really respects the how and why of how patterns can be used. One of like the core design principles of the US Web Design System is to start with user needs. So it's really encouraging practitioners to consider, what do your users need? And make sure that that is clearly defined as you go into your design process. And then for each component, everything also comes with guidance on how and when to use it, when to consider something else, and usability considerations for a specific component. So for example, for a button, it gives examples of when to use a button versus a link, how to make sure that you have like good like call to action text. And that's really helpful for me as somebody who's putting together a design for a site. And so for this project, there was definitely a lot of visual design work. We had to build a theme on top of it. There was some interaction design work, but a lot of the design work was actually driven by content. So easy to read language is a huge part of design, and it helps lower like the stress on people who are looking for information. It helps them find information that they need faster. So we used a lot of the principles from plainlanguage.gov in our project. And writing plain language about law is really hard. We were fortunate to have a great content designer on our team and also great lawyers who helped work with us on this project. And working through what people needed to know and clarifying that guidance is really what made this project successful. And a lot of the design activities that we did centered around content design. So really looking at, for low fidelity wireframes, how should the content be laid out? Doing card sorting to figure out what that navigation structure should look like. And then also doing content comprehension tests on articles. For folks who are new to the PRA, was that information coming across in the way that we expected? And so the US Web Design System was a huge asset to this project. And really helped us deliver a good design, but it doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's a lot of other pieces around it that help create good design and help us solve problems. So one of the ways that the web design system is an incredible tool is by helping us work better together as a team. So I'm going to pass it to Laura to talk a little bit about how we've used it to work better together.
Thanks, Christine. So next slide. So at the start of the year, Cloud.gov approached some folks in 18enough to address some of their main site's usability issues. Their previous site was roughly based on the Web Design System 1, but they had a few UX issues that, especially around responsiveness and some of the components, UI components, that we suggested to them it might be easier to start with a blank Web Design System 2 template and then go from that to implement some of their UX changes and usability changes. So we started with, next slide, a basic Federalist Web Design System 2 template, and then adapted it, next slide, to the Web Design System 2 systems. And the system itself really helped Christine and myself communicate across to implement this quite quickly in a short timeline. So first, next slide, was that we took the existing color palette within the site and mapped it back to the system tokens. And so for each element that we found in the site, Christine in particular sort of found the token that was approximating that. And then with that, we were able to sort of set the style palette or the site palette, both sort of in our designs as well as in our site CSS to implement that through the site. And so once we sort of set those tokens and assign them to their roles in the system tokens, we were able to, next slide, really take advantage of a lot of the design system's utilities and mix-ins to implement the coloring or the style palette really quickly. So for instance, on that homepage, you saw that some of the sort of call out bullets were these orange arrows that for us map to the secondary colors vivid token within our site palette. So if you can see it, we use the utility mix-in and the utility of text coloring to slot in that color token to implement that design. And then anytime we wanted to sort of have a little bit of that like pop on the secondary color, we could use that secondary vivid token. Next slide. And then, so another place that the system really helped us rapidly implement and iterate the design was around the spacing. And so in the design system, the spacing tokens really helped us make a consistent design spacing throughout the site and eliminate some of the custom variation around spacing. In particular, the spacing tokens are multiples of 8. And they help the designs be thought of in sort of a predefined grid unit rather than raw pixels. And then similarly, as a developer implementing them, I was able to take a combination of the spacing utility classes as well as mix-ins for both the padding and margins to put those into the CSS really quickly. And so you can see here that when we were adjusting some of the spacing on some of the pricing for cloud.gov, we could put in those tokens to have nice margins for that particular element. What was also nice about those spacing tokens is they were not just for spacing, they were also for height and width. So if we needed specific elements, they were there. And in particular, the tokens kind of also took into account some of the responsiveness, which was especially important in implementing the grid. Next slide. So also while implementing and thinking about wanting to make sure, one of the key things that we were hoping to address in this upgrade was around responsiveness. And so the grid in both the classes and the utilities, again, helped us both iterate and prototype quickly of implementing some of these designs, but also leveraging a lot of the responsive breakpoints in the media queries so that we could make sure to have a great looking site on mobile and in between media query widths for that. It made it also very easy to implement a lot of the other components because they sort of could take into account some of those responsive breakpoints by leveraging this grid. Additionally, it gave us a common language when we were doing both first iterations of a pass-through and prototyping as well as refining. This is, I think, straight from one of our GitHub issues of QA. We started talking to each other in terms of elements and design system tokens. Like for instance, a header that we wanted to increase the size rather than using the pixels, we actually were using 3XL, and I'm pretty sure I just copied that straight into the CSS with the utility mix-in. And you can see again some of the margins. For some of the pricing and elements across the site, we're able to basically speak almost entirely in design system tokens so that we could be both consistent with the design system, but I also could very quickly implement that. Then finally, we were able to achieve some of the things we set out to do while, keeping the brand feeling of cloud.gov. We in particular, were able to address some of the mobile nav styling as well as the some of the usability issues around the search bar, and but still have the site feel within that like cloud.gov feeling. So I'll pass it back to Christine for questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Laura and Austin. So yeah, that concludes our main presentation. I hope it's been helpful to hear a little bit about how we use the web design system as designers and developers, and we'd be happy to answer any questions. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, well, thank you all. There's a lot that I feel like I could dig into with way more than the 11 minutes that's available to us. I think there are a couple really interesting and sort of profound things in there. One of them was something that Austin said. It's essentially around building an atmosphere of trust in a project, in a product, in a site, and that trustworthiness is contextual, and that that is one of the important tasks of a team, is to understand that context and deliver a product that is responsive to the context. We talk a lot about responsiveness, and whether it's on your phone or whatever, but one of these things about having designers, one of their responsibilities is to be sensitive and responsible to the context of a project. So I found that as a really interesting way to talk about that. And I was wondering what, in your experience with building sites and products, is there anything you've learned about a designer is important? What have you learned about team composition in building a product? What are the important kind of roles to bring to the table in a project? Is there anything you're able to generalize about what can make a good project team, or what's critical to a good project team?
I can try and answer and then maybe see if others have thoughts. I do think every team, I feel like it really depends on the project. Each project has different needs. I think for me, the thing that's been the most consistently needed is somebody who's really focused on understanding what that user's experience is, and is able to talk with users, be able to define who those stakeholders are, and engage them with ways to get feedback on a product. So sometimes as a product designer, that's me. Sometimes it's a dedicated UX researcher. I've been on teams where we have amazing partners who really lead a lot of our research activities and can give us good feedback in that respect.
Is there any place in the design system where you wish there was more constraint? I think as the design system was sort of architected, it's sort of designed to be relatively flexible. Do you ever wish, as a designer or as someone who's trying to make a case to a stakeholder, that there was more constraint or less choice that was available to you?
I can answer that. I have had really good success with the web design system. It, for me, always feels like a selling point for design and gaining trust from our stakeholders. Because when we tell them that we can prototype things really quickly and we can get feedback directly from users in a couple days, they are usually really excited about that. And in keeping with it being fast and easy to iterate, I think it feels constrained as a system in that way. The thing I've noticed probably the most is just having to create little one-off components, but I saw that some of the things that are coming down the pike are a date picker, for example. Who would have thought I would have needed that on a government website in every one of my projects, but I have, and little things like that.
Yeah, I wonder is there anything off the top of your head that you wish were built into the design system by default that you keep having to make, or you keep having to do that same little bit of work again and again?
I'm always wondering about I think the biggest hesitation on my end is what is really, really the best practice in accessibility. So you showed tooltips. That's something that I'm always like, we should have a tooltip. I know that accordions are always like a hot button issue with people's opinions on how accessible that is and when are the use cases for it. So things like that, I really rely heavily on the expertise of our accessibility guild internally and developers and engineers who have worked a lot inside or outside the government, getting that feedback to me. And sometimes some developers say like, oh yeah, tooltip's not the best. And others are like, but I know a really cute workaround or something like that. So it just depends.
I think that's always something we're interested in bubbling up to the design system, like that sort of experience in, you know, kind of, this is the right time to use this, this is not the right time to use this sort of component, and whatever, and additionally, what kind of perhaps technical accessibility issues or otherwise that you see. So as those things come up, I certainly would be curious in hearing more of that experience. I wish every organization had access to an accessibility guild in the way that we're fortunate to have in TTS here, and I hope that we can begin to capture some of that and publish it out, yeah, built into the components and in our guidance too. I'm wondering also a little bit, like, some of these things were focused on a project that you worked on, and I've been curious to know, like, as you or others move, particularly in 18F, this happens if you move from project to project, if different projects are using the design system or starting from the design system, does it have any effect in, I don't know, portability of concepts? Like if you're moving from project A to project B and they're both using the design system, have you been in that situation? Does it help? And if it hasn't, where's the why not?
So I've worked on a couple of projects that use the web design system, and I think sometimes there's some similarities, but like each project is so different. Like I worked on the PRA guide. I've worked on a project that was around like a data visualization system that didn't really have like a ton of crossover, but you know, being familiar with the design system means that you're kind of familiar with a lot of those base components. So then you can kind of start, you're at least starting from like a similar beginning point. So for me, like it always varies a little bit based on the project and what the problem is. I might have also have been on projects that have been fairly distinct from one another.
And then is there anything that, from your perspective, off the top of your head, that you think that the design system could do to better serve designers?
I was gonna let you go, Christine. I don't want to talk too much.
No, you go first.
Let's see, I think something that I try to do with our partners is utilize their design system as much as possible too, and their brand guidelines. I think sometimes it's difficult getting those two systems to match up because I want to use the accessible components of the US web design systems, but also like the button styles and colors and fonts of each partner's unique styles.
Yeah, I agree with that. I do know that you all have, on like a more like tactical end, like I know you all have made some updates to the sketch files that have made my life a lot easier, just to be able to make it a little easier to navigate through those. And I feel like that's definitely increased the speed at which I can work. as somebody who has started for like the cloud.gov project, like I helped more with like some of the front end implementation. I do think like as somebody like kind of making that transition from designer to front end code, there's definitely like a lot there in terms of documentation for some of the helpers and mix-ins. So it was a bit of a learning curve to get there. Once we got the hang of it, it was really powerful though.
And my last question, how much do you have to argue about colors? I have found that colors can often be, rightfully or wrongfully enough, one of the more emotional decisions to make, and the design system has some opinions about colors. Yeah, I guess I was just wondering how much you find yourself in situations where color becomes a contentious. I mean, in a vague sort of way.
Yeah, no, I mean, in a real sort of way too, for sure. I have been on projects, especially public facing projects. I think we're working on internal stuff. It's not that huge of a deal, but a lot of my work, like I showed in the presentation earlier, is around setting up. I mean, it's just all a setup, how to make sure that it is always tying back to the research and how I'm always making sure that it's matching content. And I think sometimes content might be easier to like say, yes, I understand how if we use this word versus that word, it elicits different responses. So when I'm able to tie in how colors can also interface the same way, it makes the argument for colors a little bit easier. And then, you know, as I showed also in the presentation, is I leave it all up to the users and say, what are our goals? Like, do we want people to be excited when they come here, or do we want them to be somber and reflective? And just take it to users and get them to say in their own words if they felt this was more somber, if this was serious, if this was happy. And that is how I make all the decisions, but it definitely is hot topic.
I think that's good advice, Austin. All the things you mentioned, like I'll try to remember that the next time I'm making color decisions and arguments like that. You know, it really is, you know, connecting it to, again, that the context, the trust context of your project and the people who are using it, and less about this little shade or this other shade, but about setting the tone and being consistent and strong in the tone that you set, and having that tone be meaningful. Well, we're just at time. I'm going to just throw up thank you so much to Christine and Austin and Laura for coming by and sharing their experience with us. I'm going to throw up my last slide, which has some contact information. I ran out of time for all of the questions. There were a couple I saw in there. There are a couple about both Axure and the CDC Clear Communication System that I have to just say, I don't know a lot about those two things. I would love to dig into them more. I'm sorry, I can't answer those questions though. But I am happy to say that we can point to Figma resources now. So that is also exciting. I'm going to share my screen, throw up our contact info. Next month, we're going to be talking about some more new component releases, just as I discussed earlier in the hour. If you're interested in continuing this discussion, it keeps going in USWDS Public in our Slack. Check out what we're doing on GitHub, create new issues if you find them, and I'll see you next month. Thank you all for being a part of this, and I appreciate all the hard and good work you do. Thank you.